Yeah, my name's Stephen Johnston, and I do work for Itron. Itron is a world-leading technology and services company, and we're really dedicated to the resourceful use of energy and water. And it's a great pleasure. They bought the company that I helped start about 14 years ago now, and it's been a true pleasure to work for a global market leader since the acquisition. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our next speaker, and his name is John Scott, and he's with NASA. John serves as the Chief of the Energy Conversion Branch at NASA's Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. I did find out that John was actually from Memphis originally, so we grew up not too far from each other. In this capacity, he supervises the team of engineers that maintain the human spaceflight program's core technical competency in power generation, pyrotechnics, and the exploitation of lunar and planetary resources. We have a lot to learn with what he's been doing. I thought pyrotechnics was fireworks, so maybe he's going to educate us some on that in just a few minutes. He's a published author and on spacecraft power and engineering, and currently serves as NASA's Technology Roadmap team as chair of the Power and Energy Storage Committee. He's a fascinating speaker. He brings with him a wealth of knowledge of how power is being used, and I know he's integrally involved in the vision of where NASA is trying to go and what the future looks like for NASA. So we're excited to have John with us. John, thank you for being here, and please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for welcoming me, and thank you for that introduction. You know, one of the most gratifying things about working as an engineer or a scientist at NASA is the accolade you always get to receive from the general public about, and the thanks you get from the general public for all the development work we've done in technologies at NASA that has moved our country forward. I get that from the parents of my children's schoolmates. I get it from people seated next to me on an airline flight. Jason Rodriguez, who invited me to speak here today, told me that you, NASA, are where we, utilities, are going. Well, I sometimes have to sheepishly redirect credit for these innovations to where they're due, to where it's due. For example, modern photovoltaics were developed from the pull of the mission of the Defense Department rather than NASA. But where has NASA contributed to the advancement of technology for energy? Well, the best example, historically, is the hydrogen-oxygen fuel cell. Now, the basic chemistry of that was developed and thought through in the 19th century, and there were some demonstration articles built up in the early 20th, but that technology remained a solution in search of a problem until the advent of the Apollo moonshot program. At that point, NASA engineers had to find a way to power the Apollo spacecraft independent of the sun and for as little mass as possible. So they looked at charts like this one. This chart's from that era, by the way. That's why it looks the way it does. And it's based on fundamentals of chemistry and physics. They looked at that and decided that the fuel cell was the right answer. So NASA's interest in fuel cell technology had nothing to do with alternative energy. We didn't have any alternative. We had to make fuel cells work to get to the moon. And as it turned out, to make the space shuttle fly as well. That's also fuel cell powered. So what we did was invest in some companies or give contracts to small companies back in the 60s and 70s to bring fuel cell technology forward. And as a matter of fact, the engineering teams formed at those small companies developed into teams that were able to respond to the hydrogen economy initiative in the 1990s and early 2000s and grew into that field. So I can even point out that all of the commercial fuel cell teams today trace their corporate heritage, their intellectual property heritage, even their personnel heritage to the three companies that NASA funded back in the 1960s and 70s. So the fuel cell is one of the human spaceflight program's most effective spinoffs. Now, but what have we done for you lately? What's NASA doing in technology now? Well, NASA has a number of missions in the works, unpiloted missions, from another Curiosity-type rover on Mars to a robotic mission to Europa. But the real driver, the real pull for power and energy technology from NASA is from our initiative for the human exploration of Mars. Now, NASA is in the process of developing technology roadmaps for all the technologies and all the fields we need to carry out that and other missions. And I have the honor of leading the team for power and energy. So, of course, that's the most important one. But seriously, the most critical technology for our Mars mission, the technology that has the most leverage on our mission capability, is power for electric propulsion for the Mars mission. Now, human Mars architectures look something like this. They involve a relatively slow, unpiloted flight carrying cargo for a Mars mission from Earth to the Mars surface, followed by a sprint, a high-power sprint of about 6 months duration, give or take, from Earth to Mars that's launched when the planets are closely aligned. The crew then stays on the Mars base for 400, 500, 600 days, depending on the option in play, and then until the planets align again, and then for another sprint back home. Now, the most important figure of merit for the propulsion system that is required for this is called specific mass. So many kilograms per kilowatt. And the smaller that number is, the faster you can get from Earth to Mars with everything else held constant. And getting the crew from Earth to Mars quickly is very important because it's terribly important to minimize the exposure of the crew to cosmic radiation. That radiation is much worse than anything from a nuclear power plant. Okay? So with the studies we've taken up lately, we've done a number of trade studies for the propulsion systems that we need to go to Mars, and they have settled recently on a solar power system for the electric thrusters that we'll need to use. This solar power system will require deploying a 5,000 square meter array of radiation-tolerant inverted metamorphic photovoltaic cells that have 33% efficiency at the beginning of life, and will and produce a megawatt of power. All right. Now, that gives you this type of Mars mission. 439 days out, 300 days on the surface, 326 back. It gives you a specific mass of about 30 kilograms a kilowatt, a little bit less. Now, one thing you might notice is that we have another option we studied using nuclear power. That gives you a much shorter transit time to Mars and less exposure to the cosmic radiation. And it does that by having a specific mass under 20 kilograms a kilowatt. And that 20 kilograms a kilowatt is a fraction of what it takes, of what you would get from a submarine nuclear power plant. It's a much more sophisticated reactor. The reactor called for in this option is in this study option is a solid core fast spectrum fission reactor with an operating temperature of 1,500 Kelvin. That's about twice the temperature of a typical civil power reactor. And it requires heat rejection radiators of 5,000 square meters. So you don't have to deploy the 5,000 square meters of solar arrays for this mission, but you have to deploy almost that same area of heat rejection radiators. But even though this gives you a quicker trip to Mars, the cost of developing or certifying on the ground that fission reactor is enormous. So that's what points us toward the solar option for our current studies. Okay. Someone's a solar fan, I think. Okay. I'm sure there's quite a few of you out there, as a matter of fact. Okay, but in either option, these missions require up to 7 launches of 130 metric tons each to carry the mission off. 130 metric tons is about 5 times what a space shuttle launch would put into low Earth orbit. Okay. And so this mission, with our budget projections as they are, what the taxpayer wants to spend on NASA, with those as they are, and and our technology development plans for the solar array, they add up to offer a human landing on Mars in about 20 years from now, in 2035. Now, if you pay attention to the history, a Mars landing has been that far away since the 1970s when NASA first imposed it. Why is that? Well, this is a very expensive, very long mission. It has to be. Those launch vehicles may cost $1 billion apiece. each of those 130 metric ton launches. So that's the best we can do with the funding we have. Now, but you might ask the question, what does it take to make this mission faster, cheaper, and happen sooner? Well, in a nutshell, to do anything better than this, we end up having to either get around the rocket equation, and that's a subject for another conference, or we have to make a certain type of nuclear fusion work. There's just no other way around it. Now, there are advanced energy technologies that, in theory, could reduce our spacecraft's power system-specific mass down to 2 or even 1 kilogram a kilowatt. Now, with that specific mass, we could send with only 1 or 2 of those expensive launches, we could send a crew to Mars, have them spend a month on the surface, and get them back home inside a calendar year. In some cases, you might even be able to launch them on Valentine's Day and get them back home in time for Christmas shopping. Now, those technologies, though, are barely out of the peer-reviewed literature, much less out of the laboratory. And NASA's technology plan doesn't pull on them. Why not? We're very conservative in the technologies we assume for our mission planning. Well, the fundamental thing is this. We have the space program that the taxpayers tell us to have. And they tell us through the mechanisms of our representative democracy with all the sausage making that involves. Now, in that environment, once a project manager has a real budget and a real schedule, the last thing he wants to do is have to invent something and make sure planning assessment is very conservative. As a matter of fact, we can't move in this environment. Just like with a large corporation proposing their shareholders, you don't want to tell White House and Congress that your agency's future depends upon some disruptive breakthrough. So we stick with what we know we can do. We're like good scientists. We're always telling our investors, our funding agencies, what we can do and why that's good. And this is what we can do. But in that situation, how do you ever get a breakthrough? How do you ever get an energy breakthrough? Well, that's the trillion-dollar question, isn't it? That's even more urgent for the terrestrial power industry than it is for NASA's space mission. Elected officials, when talking about energy policy and climate change, are fond of pronouncing that we need a Manhattan Project in order to solve these problems. Well, that sounds awfully expensive and awfully unobtainable. And apparently, making that proclamation alone does not make that project happen. So what does make it happen? Well, let's take a look at that. Let's go back to 1939. In January of that year, fission of the uranium nucleus was observed in laboratories in Copenhagen, Washington, D.C., and Berlin. In April of that year, Nobel laureate Niels Bohr presented a paper at the annual meeting of the American Physical Society, in which he pronounced that a chain reaction in the rare isotope of uranium, U-235, could release an energy at such a rate to enable a power plant, or in some cases, if you could concentrate the isotope, enable an explosion. But he wasn't the least bit sure of how to concentrate that isotope. But paying attention to that conference were other Nobel laureates. That included Enrico Fermi, then in the United States, Dr. James Chadwick in the United Kingdom, and Werner Heisenberg in Germany. They all saw the implications. A few months later, September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, kicking off the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And Dr. Heisenberg and his colleagues went to the Nazi war ministry to discuss the military applications of uranium fission. A month later, Franklin Roosevelt was read a letter from Albert Einstein that warned that the uranium fission could be used to create a very powerful bomb, and that the Germans were probably working on it. Now, Roosevelt responded by forming a committee. Several months later, in November of 1939, that committee reported back essentially this: look, this nuclear fission stuff is real. We can make a power source. It can be harnessed to make a power source, make a reactor, to run a submarine forever. Making a weapon from it, well, that's awfully tricky. We don't know how you're going to concentrate the isotopes to do that, and it's not something that's likely to happen anytime soon. A month later, Werner Heisenberg told his government essentially the same thing. You could work on a reactor, but the bomb is something we'll have to get to incrementally. Both teams of scientists in both countries were recommending that they pursue a power source, and incrementally work their way up to a weapon. They were both saying, like good scientists, here's what we can do, and here's why it's good. And both governments, both the Nazis and that in the United States, responded with limited interest. Look, there's a war on, or there's about to be. We need a weapon more urgently than we need a power source. As a matter of fact, as late as July of 1942, Heisenberg presented to Albert Speer in Germany that they were 2 years away from that reactor. Speer's response was, look, if we haven't won this war in 2 years, that reactor's not going to do us any good. We need a weapon. And he supposedly asked Heisenberg point blank, what will it take to get that bomb? How many billion Reichsmarks do you need? And Heisenberg apparently didn't understand the question. He fed back, no, well, we need to keep moving with the reactor first, and then we'll get to the weapon, and just give us a little bit of money to do cross-section studies. The German bomb effort essentially stopped right there. Thank God it did. It was in the UK, however, that the scientists had a different perspective. They were being bombed. They looked at the data and asked different questions. Dr. Chadwick and his associates looked at the uranium fission data and said, well, if you could separate the isotopes, if you could concentrate it, how much would you need, how much U-235 would you need to sustain a chain reaction with fast neutrons, which would enable an extremely powerful bomb? Their calculation came out to be, it would be just at 1 kilogram. It turned out to be more, but it was that order. They were pretty much right. So in July of 1941, they presented to their government this story. Look, we need a bomb. We need a weapon. And here's what it takes to get it. Here's where we might be wrong. Here's the risk. Here is the massive expense involved. Now, at that point, the UK government was bankrupt. The US hadn't entered the war yet. So they sent Dr. Mark Oliphant, he was one of their physicists, over across the pond to see us. And that kicked off the Manhattan Project. A few weeks before Pearl Harbor, the US government committed $2 million, that's what, $30 million today, to do some design studies for separation plants and the weapon, but mostly to do an experiment to see whether the scientists were right about chain reactions in uranium. Could you really make one happen? Well, a year later, the Chicago pile proved that yes, you could. You could make that chain reaction. Within weeks, ground was broken at Hanford and Oak Ridge for the separation plants. And 2.5 years and $2 billion 1940 later was the Trinity test. Nuclear fission had gone from a physics paper to an operating system in 6 years with a spinoff of civil nuclear power generation. So, what's in the physics literature today that might be an energy source as disruptive as nuclear power? Well, there's a number of things. One about which there's a good deal of buzz is called LENR, low energy nuclear reactions. That's a further development of the cold fusion research that was done back in the 1990s. What's going on there, at least what's proposed to be going on there, if you have a certain metal with a surface of certain characteristics that's exposed to deuterium gas at the right conditions, right pressure and temperature, you get a reaction going on that releases heat, consuming no fuel and emitting no radiation. Now, physicists are hotly disagreeing about what nuclear reaction may be going on in these LENR cells, and peer-reviewed data is next to non-existent. So I'll talk about another potential innovation about which I know a little bit more. This is the fusion reaction between hydrogen and boron-11. Now, in contrast to the deuterium-tritium fusion reaction that releases its energy as neutrons primarily, thereby requiring heat engine conversion and producing a large amount of low-level nuclear waste, the hydrogen-boron-11 reaction produces all its energy as charged particles that enables direct conversion, much more efficient, a much smaller plant, and produces no nuclear waste. If we could harness this reaction, it could produce a power system that, for a space that could get that low specific mass and enable NASA to have that rapid Mars mission. Of course, it would also enable, as a spinoff, a civil power source that would have, release no carbon, produce no radioactive waste, have a capital requirement per megawatt on the same order as that of a gas turbine plant and use only a minuscule amount of an abundant fuel. Now, that's disruptive. Whoever comes up with that will unlikely not have time to support NASA's piddly little Mars mission. But what does it take to do that? Well, to get that type of, to get this reaction, this type of nuclear fusion to its Chicago pile moment takes tens of millions of dollars, at least. Tens of millions of dollars invested for any given concept. The gamble is quite large. You're investing into, at best, 1 in 3 odds of success. But if you, the bigger question, though, is that if you do get to that Chicago pile moment, if you do get there, how much would it take to go from that laboratory experiment, essentially, from that Chicago pile to a operating system? Well, remember, in the case of the original Manhattan Project, that took many billions of dollars. But the key point to note there, that from the get-go, the scientists proposing the nuclear weapons project explained and admitted that making that bomb happen, or a reactor happen, required what was essentially unobtainium, uranium-235, plutonium. And of the billions that were spent after the Chicago pile and up until Trinity, 95% of that money went into obtaining the unobtainium. Now, if the physics projections of proton-boron 11 fusion are correct, and proven correct by its Chicago pile moment, no unobtainium would be required. And the development of from that point to say a space-certified, a space-flyable power source would be no more expensive than that of a multi-megawatt photovoltaic array. And of course, it would disrupt the global energy industry if you did that as well. So what you can see from this is that these truly disruptive energy changes are not 30, 40, or 50 years away. They're either 6 years away or never. And the trick is it takes tens of millions of dollars in 2 years to find out which one it is for any given concept. But if the taxpayer wants NASA to get people to Mars and back and explore Mars in our lifetime, that's what it takes. If investors want their entrepreneur to be the ultimate disruptor of the energy industry as opposed to a disruptee, that's what it takes. If we, as a society, truly believe that anthropogenic carbon emissions have to be eliminated to avert a catastrophic climate change, that's what it takes. Thank you for your kind attention.
Please. Thank you. John, thank you for being with us. I don't know if anybody wants to ask questions for John real quick. If anybody wants to come over, please come over. Because the topic that you are enlightening us with is tremendous. And I think that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We're so close to what's going on in NASA, so I appreciate you being here, John. Please, question.
Hi, I'm Bill Meehan. It's a great job. Thanks.
Thank you.
What about, I've heard buzz about solar in space and transmission from solar.
Oh, the solar power satellite?
Yeah.
That concept's been around for quite a while. And again, the driver for that, it's a tremendous amount of capital you've got to accelerate to low Earth orbit. And of course, the more efficient your photovoltaic cells are, the less that is. The cheaper launch cost is, the more accessible that is. But again, it becomes a huge capital investment for one power plant. And you can make a large one. And something I should have said earlier, that's almost like doing the deuterium-tritium fusion plants, the tokamaks, like the ITER project. I mean, those things, they've had their Chicago pile moment, and that'll work. But what they've discovered is that you have to make the plant huge to contain the reaction at all. And even though the fuel may be free, capital never is. You may as well solve our problems, energy problems, by paving Arizona with photovoltaics and then making West Texas into a storage battery. People could do that here. And then what you'd have is a situation that would displace a lot of people and cost a lot of money. That's the trouble with renewables. They're not very dense. For example, and again, that solar satellite would be the same thing. It'd be a huge capital investment that would take a lot of patient capital, more than the Earth can probably muster. A good example of how renewables act, and just to carry that on, how renewables can end up affecting things. A great renewable energy project, several gigawatts of installed capacity, is Three Gorges Dam in China. You know, it's a hydroelectric plant, clean as can be, displaced almost 2 million people. So is that the right trade? That I don't know. Yes, sir.
Hi there, Michael Walsh. And I had the pleasure of attending a thorium energy conference in Chicago last year, and I didn't hear any mention of it, but first question is, did thorium have its Chicago pile moment in Oak Ridge? I think we had an operating plant running on thorium in the past, and if you could comment on that, please.
Okay, well, I'll comment from the point of view of a space user. The thing about, you know, that's basically another form of nuclear fission. You know, is a different fuel cycle. From the point of view of a space application, you're trying to get that specific mass down. That really doesn't help you much. I mean, the reactor I was talking about here is basically, that I mentioned in our design study, that's basically bomb-grade uranium. Okay, and it's nothing you would ever use in a terrestrial power plant. What thorium cycle does for you is that it enables you to breed your own, it's not a breeder reactor per se, but it enables you to create your own fuel from much more abundant elements than uranium. Thorium is much more abundant. But you still produce activated waste. You still have a risk of Fukushima. You know, and that's something that hasn't been too tolerable. I had a, so again, it's not particularly interested to the space industry because of, you know, it doesn't really do much for you in performance. I can see where it could be a lot cheaper to operate plants that way commercially, but again, you've got the same overarching issues that they have. I've had the pleasure of knowing a retired director of Oak Ridge National Labs, who in turn has spoke a lot to the founders of the civil nuclear power industry. And what would they have done differently? You know, power was going to be too cheap to meter, right? And then it hasn't worked out. Well, what the early pioneers of that would tell you is that they were too much like engineers. They were focusing on making the plant more efficient, which the thorium cycle would do, making it cheaper, when what they should have been focusing on was making it idiot-proof. Okay, so we're in a situation to where, yeah, it's a great clean power source, and really there isn't much waste to be made, but it's kind of scary.
Real quick, they did say that there's no chance of a meltdown with thorium.
Well, but you're still producing. Now, understand that failure mode may not be there, and there isn't with our space reactors either, for that matter. But you're still producing activated waste, which is dangerous to handle. But and again, you know how much that really costs or should cost is beyond my pay grade. Yes, sir.
I feel like I'm in an episode of Resurrection, because 30 years ago at this university, my master's thesis was on finding the minimum radius reverse field pinch that could reach ignition, and I have a formula to my name. So now 30 years later, here I am, hearing that it's only 6 years away.
If you want it bad enough.
Yes.
That's the if.
The question that I have is, why do you think the mirror fusion concept was mothballed for the tokamak with bad curvature that does not allow for these charged particles to come out because of the geometry? I would think that the mirror design is the more conducive to get that flux out.
It would be, but again, the mirror, I'll answer your question direct. I may have to answer you afterwards a little bit for this audience. Yeah. Both those fusion concepts involve a Maxwellian plasma. You're containing a Maxwellian plasma because that's what you can do to contain, you can get deuterium-tritium fusion that way. But most of the energy comes out not as those charged particles, but as neutrons, absorbed in a blanket, heat, boilers, heat engine conversion. The trouble with that, you can't do proton-borne 11, this slide's gone. You can't do it with that kind of plasma confinement.
Correct. Because
you'll end up, your losses will exceed your fusion power output. So it's I mean, whether or not it's a better trade for a deuterium-tritium fusion power plant, I can't really say. I mean, I think people came up with the idea that tokamak was a better way to go, but and that's again another whole other field. But again, it wouldn't do you any good for the neutronic reactions. Well, I take that back. I was
talking about the D-helium-3.
Yes, you can't. Yeah, right. You can do deuterium-helium-3 this way, but if you do it that way, it's not really a neutronic. You've got a side reaction going on, and you're still producing, low-level waste. All right. And besides, helium-3 is awfully hard to come by.
Yeah. I did notice that on your cross-sections, if you were to mention a little bit of the temperature sensitivity of the cross-sections, because that really changes the recipe that you have to use to get there.
Yeah, well, we've gotten into that. And we'll talk later. Okay. Yes, sir.
I hope I'm not going to be beating a dead horse, but to follow up on the thorium question, is the primary objection with NASA the size, or is it the primary objection the waste? Because I know that there have been ideas proposed for putting these things, thorium reactors, on airplanes, for example.
Well, but they had uranium reactors on airplanes too. Okay, you know, NASA's lack of interest comes to the fact that in terms of this performance metric, specific mass, it just doesn't do you any good compared to uranium. The waste issue, well, that's why it costs so dang much for us to certify a space reactor. You know, I mean, it ends up, if you have to deal with activated waste, it just, well, an arm way to discuss that. I mean, any multi-megawatt space power system is going to cost you $1 billion from, you know, the lab experiment to flight. If it involves creating waste with a regulatory environment around it, add another $1 billion on top of that. And people often accuse me of lowballing on the second $1 billion. So, yes, sir.
I've got kind of an easy, I guess, citizen question for you.
Okay.
No technical stuff. I'm just curious, you talk about taxpayer, I guess, buy-in, and that being kind of a prime reason why it's always 20 years away, the manned mission to Mars. Obviously, there's some aspects of physics and things like that. But
well, I mean, the rocket equation rules that. But the cost of doing that, well, the taxpayer only wants to spend so much a year.
Sure,
and it's our job to do the best we can.
Sure. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on some of the private companies that have kind of cropped up over the last, you know, however many years, SpaceX, you know, different projects like that. I'm curious as to how you see those, and if maybe 20 years that isn't 20 years for them, or maybe, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I mean, what they're doing, and doing very well, is lowering the cost of that initial launch to low Earth orbit. Okay, and yeah, that does have an effect on this. Instead of $1 billion a pop for those launches, maybe it's 500 million. And that makes a difference, but it doesn't fundamentally change anything. You know, again, the mission's still 3 years long. You know, one of the problems that many of us at NASA have with the 3-year mission is, you know, Magellan was gone 3 years, and he didn't make it. You know, of the 4 ships, only 1 ship made it. Of the 4 that didn't, 2 had a technology problem. 1 sank in the storm. The other one had a bottom rot out. Okay, technology issues which you can solve. The other 2 mutinied. Technology doesn't solve that one. 3 years is too dang long.
Thank you, everybody. John Scott.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.